The thing that got to me first wasn't seeing anything. It was realizing I had started changing how I moved, like I was already trying not to be noticed before I had any actual reason to think someone was out there. I was standing a few feet off the porch with my camera hanging against my chest, waiting out a long exposure, trying not to shift my weight too much because the snow under my boots had that hard crust on top that snaps if you move even a little. The whole clearing was blue and black and silver from the moonlight. The cabin sat behind me with one yellow porch bulb on, and beyond that was nothing but tree line and the logging road curling off into dark. I remember the air smelled like cold pine and wet wood smoke from the stovepipe, and every time I breathed in too hard it made my front teeth ache. The shutter clicked shut. I looked down to check the preview. At first I thought the image was great. Sharp stars, clean horizon, nice separation in the trees. Then I noticed this faint vertical smear between two trunks off to the left side of the frame. Not bright, not dramatic, just something that looked wrong in a way I couldn't pin down right away. I zoomed in on the screen with my glove off, thumb dragging across the display, and for a second I honestly thought it was just my own handshake, or maybe the tripod settling into the snow. That happens, especially with longer exposures if you don't get the legs planted right. But when I went back through the last few shots, that blur only showed up in one of them. And it was right where I'd been pointing the camera the whole time. I rented that cabin because I wanted exactly what it was. No traffic, no people, no orange city glow bleeding into the sky. No neighbor's floodlight turning the trees into silhouettes that ruined everything. I live in Spokane, work too much, spend most of my week staring at two monitors and pretending I'm fine with how much of my life happens under fluorescent lights. A few months before this, I'd bought a used DSLR from a guy who was upgrading his setup, and I got a little obsessed with the idea of learning night photography properly instead of just messing around with my phone and telling myself that counted. So I booked this place in northern Montana for a long weekend. It was off an old logging road far enough out that the rental listing made a point of saying nearest neighbor over 5 miles away, like that was a perk, which to me it kind of was. I like being alone. Not in a sad way. I just mean silence doesn't usually bother me. If anything, I go looking for it when everything starts to feel too crowded. The first drive in was exactly what I wanted. Packed snow on the road, tall black firs on both sides, one deer that stood in the trees and watched my car go past like it was annoyed I was using its road. The cabin itself was small but clean. One main room, little kitchen, wood stove, narrow bedroom, a porch that looked out into a clearing big enough for sky shots. No cell signal once I got the last few miles in. I knew that going in. I actually liked it. I unpacked slow, set my extra batteries by the wall heater, put protein bars and a couple of store-brand energy drinks on the counter because I forgot coffee, which annoyed me more than it should have. I checked the windows, got the stove going, and spent the last light of the day walking the edge of the clearing looking for compositions. There was a nice break in the trees to the north, and those same two trunks about 30 feet out from the porch framed the sky in a way I kept coming back to. It all felt easy, quiet in the good way. That first evening I took maybe a few dozen shots, mostly wide sky stuff, a few test exposures with the cabin in frame, some longer ones once the moon shifted and the dark got cleaner. I was still learning, so I kept doing what every amateur does, which is take 3 versions of the same photo and convince yourself there's a real technical reason for it. Nothing about that first evening felt off. Not then. The blur in the image should have stayed a blur in the image. That's what I told myself. A weird exposure artifact. Me moving. Maybe a branch catching just enough wind to ghost across the frame even though I hadn't felt any. I even stood there and tried to recreate it by lightly tapping one tripod leg with my boot. The smear looked different, wider, less defined. I remember thinking, okay, so not that. Then I laughed at myself a little because the other option was what, exactly? Someone standing out there long enough to show up in only one exposure and not the others. I went back inside, set the camera on the table, and started flipping through shots while the stove popped and settled. The cabin had that dry heat old wood stoves make, where your face feels warm but your hands stay cold for a while. I zoomed in on the blur again. Still nothing clear. It looked like a person only if you were already in the mood to think person. So I wasn't. I told myself it was lens weirdness or low light noise or me wanting the trip to feel more interesting than it was. About an hour later, I went back out. The sky had opened up even more by then. The kind of cold where the stars don't just look bright, they look close. I set up in nearly the same spot, this time bracing the tripod legs harder into the snow and checking each lock twice. I took a run of exposures facing the clearing, then turned slightly left to use those same 2 trees again because the composition was better than anything else on the property. While one of the longer shots was running, I found myself staring at that gap between the trunks without meaning to. Nothing there. I checked the preview when the shutter closed. There it was again. Not identical. That made it worse. If it had been the exact same shape in the exact same spot, I think I would have relaxed because then it would have felt like a sensor issue or some reflection problem. But this one was a little closer to the cabin and a little narrower, like whatever caused it had changed position. I remember standing there with my glove half on, fingertips burning from the cold, and feeling this dumb resistance in my own head. Like I didn't want to walk out and look because I knew if I found nothing I'd feel stupid, and if I found something I'd feel worse. I still went. I took my flashlight off the porch hook and started toward the tree line, cutting the beam low across the snow. The light made everything look flatter than it was. Blue-white crust on top, softer powder under it. My boots sank and crunched. The whole clearing felt louder when I was in it than when I stood still. I got near the spot where the blur had been in frame and saw tracks. Just one set. Not mine. I knew they weren't mine because mine came straight from the porch in a messy loop around the tripod, then back again. These were coming in from the left side of the clearing at an angle, deeper than mine, sharper at the edges. Boot prints. Bigger than mine, too. I stopped counting after 4 or 5 because what mattered wasn't how many there were. What mattered was where they ended. The tracks came out of the dark, crossed open snow, and stopped maybe 20 feet from the porch. Not turned around. Not drifted over, just stopped, like whoever made them had been standing there long enough to pack the snow down in one spot and then wasn't there anymore. I swept the flashlight all over the clearing, up the trunks, into the branches, across the porch roof, back toward the road. Nothing. I even crouched to see if maybe there were lighter prints leading off onto harder crust I couldn't catch from standing height. Nothing I could make sense of. I know how that sounds. Boots don't just stop. A person doesn't walk into the middle of a clearing and disappear. I stood there longer than I should have, light shaking a little because my hand had started doing that thing where it gets tight from cold and adrenaline at the same time. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the rest of the tracks were older and had filled in weird. Maybe I was looking at overlapping prints. Maybe an animal had torn up the surface enough to hide where the person turned off. I backed up to the porch without taking the light off that spot. Inside, I locked the door even though it had already been locked. Then I checked the windows. Then I felt stupid for checking the windows because who was going to see me do that except me? I barely slept the first night, but not because I thought somebody was definitely out there. It was more that I couldn't get comfortable with not understanding the tracks. I kept replaying the shape of them, the depth, the distance from the porch. Around 1 in the morning, I actually picked up my camera and looked at the images again just to prove to myself I was building a whole problem out of 2 blurry frames and some weird snow. The next morning made it worse. I stepped outside with coffee I'd managed to improvise from instant packets I found buried in my duffel, and the first thing I noticed was that the snow around my setup area had preserved almost everything from the night before. My loops to and from the porch, the tripod divots, the place where I stood shifting my boots while I changed settings. And I knew right away, before I walked over to confirm it, that those other prints had not been there when I first set up. I'm careful with gear. I notice the ground I'm putting it on, especially in snow. I had stomped around out there at dusk, adjusting the tripod height and checking angles. If a set of boot prints had already come that close to the porch, I would have seen them. I would have stepped in them probably. But the snow had been smooth then. I was sure of it in the specific irritating way you're only sure of something small, not dramatic certainty. Just that same feeling as knowing where you left your keys because you remember hearing them hit the table. So that meant the prints had shown up sometime after I started shooting. That sat with me all day. And because I'm apparently exactly the kind of person who will rationalize himself into bad decisions if enough astronomy is involved, I didn't leave. I wish I could tell you there was some strong practical reason. That the road was iced over, or my car wouldn't start, or I had to stay because of weather. None of that. The weather was clear, the car was fine. I stayed because part of me still thought there had to be a simple answer, and another part of me didn't want to be the guy who ran back to town because of a blurry image and some footprints. Daytime helped, a little. I walked more of the property. There really was no one around. Just trees, the logging road, the cabin, an old wood pile with a tarp half frozen to it, and a little shed too packed with split logs and rusted tools to hide anything bigger than a raccoon. I looked for more tracks leading into the clearing from other angles and found some partial impressions in the woods that could have been from days earlier. Hard to tell. The sun never got warm enough to soften much. I checked around the cabin itself too, telling myself I was just being thorough, and found nothing at the windows, nothing at the door, nothing under the porch except shadow and old spider webs turned silver with frost. By late afternoon, I almost had myself settled again. That was the part that bothers me now. How normal the day felt in the middle. I made soup from a can, sat at the little table and cleaned snow off my tripod feet with a towel from the bathroom. Read through the camera manual like I was going to suddenly become a more disciplined person at the age of 30. I even laughed once because I'd taken one photo where my own breath had drifted through frame and made it look like the Milky Way was haunting the porch. If the whole thing had stayed at the level of unease, I probably would have finished the weekend and never told anyone. Then evening came back. I didn't want to use the same angle again, which already tells you where my head was. So I started with the road, then the roofline, then a tight shot through the branches on the west side. But everything in me kept tracking back to that gap between the two trees, not because it was the best composition anymore, because I wanted to prove to myself that if I aimed there long enough, nothing would happen. That logic is embarrassing now, but it felt solid at the time. So I set up facing the same spot. A few exposures in, I noticed something I hadn't the night before. Every time the shutter was open, I got hyper-aware of my own stillness, of how long I was standing there, not moving, not looking around, just waiting. And I started thinking about what I looked like from the tree line. One person in a clearing lit dimly from behind by a porch bulb, attention fixed one direction, face hidden by the camera. Easy to watch, easy to approach without me noticing until I lowered it. I turned the porch light off after that because it felt like broadcasting myself. Bad decision, or maybe good, I still don't know. With the porch light off, the cabin windows went black and the clearing got deeper. My eyes adjusted after a minute, but not evenly. The tree line seemed farther away until I stared too long, then it felt closer. The only real light was snow and stars. I could hear the tiny mechanical sounds of the camera doing its thing. Mirror. Click. The soft electronic chirp I'd forgotten to disable. Somewhere deeper in the woods, something cracked a branch, and then there was nothing again. I took 3 more photos. On the third one, the preview showed no blur, which should have felt good. Instead, it felt like when a noise stops in the next room and you realize the noise had been helping. I stood there with the camera still in my hands, looking over the top of it instead of through it. I scanned the clearing. Left tree, right tree, dark space between. Nothing. I told myself out loud quietly that I was going to take one last shot and then go inside. Hearing my own voice in that open space made me regret using it. I set the timer, stepped back, and looked through the viewfinder. Those 2 trees again. Clean frame, sharp stars, the black seam of woods behind them, the shutter finished. I lowered the camera, and there was someone standing between those same 2 trees, not close enough for detail, close enough to know it was a person. Tall, or maybe just made taller by the trunks on either side. Dark clothing, no visible face, just a figure standing perfectly still in a place that had been empty every other time I looked with my own eyes. I didn't hear steps. I didn't hear breathing. I don't even remember inhaling myself. It felt like my body paused before my mind did, like I hadn't decided whether seeing it counted as a reason to move yet. Then I blinked. I know that sounds like a stupid thing to remember, but I do. My eyes watered from the cold and I blinked once hard, and the space between the trees was empty again. I stumbled backward so fast one tripod leg folded and the camera almost went over. I caught it against my chest, hit the porch with the back of my legs, and dropped the flashlight I hadn't realized I was still holding. It hit the boards and rolled, beams spinning across the clearing in a wild white arc. When the light passed over the snow in front of the cabin, I saw them. Fresh footprints. A set of boot prints coming straight toward the porch steps. Not from the side like before. Straight on. I don't know how many, I saw enough. The nearest one was maybe 6 feet from the bottom step, edges crisp, snow still granular in the impression like it had just been made. The beam rolled again and threw the trees into darkness, and I did not wait to see if there was another one after that. I got inside, slammed the door, threw the lock, then the deadbolt, then shoved the little kitchen table against it, even though it barely came up to the knob and would have done absolutely nothing if somebody really wanted in. My hands were working wrong. That was the first clear sign of fear. Not the seeing, not the prints. My hands. I kept missing things by an inch. Dropped one lens cap, couldn't get the zipper on my camera bag the first 2 tries. I turned off every light except the one over the stove, then turned that off too because I didn't want to stand in a lit room next to black windows. The cabin went dark except for the stove glow. I listened for steps on the porch. Nothing. That somehow felt worse than if I'd heard them. I packed in a crouch like being lower mattered. Batteries, charger, laptop, camera bodies, memory cards, toothbrush still damp from that morning. Clothes shoved into my duffel in a way that would have made me insane if I'd been calm. I left food in the fridge, left one glove on the bed and didn't go back for it. Every few seconds I stopped and listened, and every time there was still nothing. No knock, no voice, no attempt at the knob, just that feeling. The one I'd had outside, only now there were walls around it. I didn't wait for sunrise. I waited until the sky shifted enough that black turned to dark blue and the trees came back as shapes instead of emptiness. Maybe an hour before dawn. Maybe less. I never checked. I put the bags by the door, stood there for a full minute arguing with myself about whether to look out the window first, decided absolutely not, moved the table, unlocked everything, and went straight to the car. The snow by the porch was marked up from my own running feet almost immediately, and I kept my eyes down because I didn't want to see if there were other prints mixed in. I threw everything into the back, got in, locked the doors, and started the engine on the second try. I remember the steering wheel felt like stone. I remember reversing too fast and spraying powder up over the side mirrors. I remember not once looking back at the cabin itself, not even when I turned onto the logging road and had to slow at the bend. I just left. I drove until I had signal again, then pulled over near a gas station that smelled like burnt coffee and bleach and called the rental owner. I told him something had spooked me and I was cutting the trip short. I almost mentioned the prints, but once I heard another person's normal voice on the line, it all sounded thin and ridiculous in my own head. He asked if anything had happened with the cabin. I said no, not exactly. He said, "Okay, thanks for letting him know." That was it. I got home, unloaded the car, and didn't look at the photos for almost a week. When I finally did, the last frame from that night showed the clearing empty. No figure. No obvious shape between the trees, just snow, trunks, stars, and the line of dark behind them where the forest started. If I hadn't seen what I saw after lowering the camera, I would have called the whole thing stress and bad light and isolation doing what isolation does. The tracks weren't in that frame either. At least not the ones near the porch. The angle didn't go low enough. I've gone back out alone since then, but never that far from other people and never without checking the ground every few minutes like I've turned into some nervous amateur tracker. I still use that camera. Still shoot at night sometimes, but I don't stay fixed on one section of woods for long anymore, and I don't leave a porch light behind me unless I want to know exactly what it makes me visible to. Because that's the part I still can't make fit. Not the blur, not even the figure. It's why the footprints always appeared where my camera had been pointed and never where I was actually looking at the time. Story 2. The next one came from a man who was used to being alone, which honestly makes what happened to him feel worse. The first thing I noticed was the front door being wrong by about half an inch. That doesn't sound like much, and I know that, but when you spend enough time checking properties in winter, you start seeing little things before you consciously register them. A latch sitting loose, frost line different around a frame, wind not hitting a place the way it should. I was walking up to the Miller cabin with my keys in one hand and my notebook tucked under my arm, and before I got to the step, I knew that door wasn't sitting the way I'd left it 3 days earlier. I stopped and looked at the jamb. The deadbolt wasn't thrown. The knob wasn't fully seated. The door had been pulled shut but not secured. There was no reason for that. And because there was no reason for it, I stood there longer than I needed to, looking at that small gap between wood and frame while cold air got in around the collar of my coat. The property was quiet in that mountain way where even your own breathing sounds borrowed. No vehicles, no dogs, no chainsaw noise from farther off, nothing. Just a little trickle of meltwater somewhere under ice and the soft creek trees make when the wind presses on them. I set my notebook on the porch rail, put the key in anyway out of habit, and the lock turned without resistance. Inside, someone had pulled one of the kitchen chairs into the middle of the room and turned it to face the door. I was hired that winter to look after a spread of cabins on a private mountain property in Appalachia, miles from the nearest real town and farther than that from anywhere you could count on getting help quickly if you needed it. Some of the cabins were rentals in better weather. Some were just family properties the owner kept because they'd been there forever. My job was simple enough on paper. Drive the loop every few days, make sure pipes and heaters were holding, clear what had to be cleared, check for storm damage, signs of forced entry, broken windows, animal problems, anything like that. I stayed in one of the smaller cabins near the maintenance shed and handled it alone because that was how the owner ran things in winter. That kind of work suited me. I'd done property maintenance a long time, different places, different scales. Vacation homes, hunting cabins, a church camp one year that nearly froze solid because the board didn't want to pay for proper weatherization. I like systems. I like knowing where things are supposed to be. I like being able to fix something with my hands and write down what I did so there isn't any argument later about whether it was done. That's why I keep a notebook instead of trusting my memory. Pocket-sized, hardcover, black, with dates across the top of each page and every cabin log separate. Furnace checked, water line bled, window latch repaired, generator tested. It sounds tedious if you don't do the work. To me, it's how you keep small problems from becoming expensive ones. The cabins themselves were spread out enough that a full round took most of a day in winter. Narrow roads, some gravel, some dirt. A couple stretches that turned to rutted clay if the weather softened. There were maybe 7 cabins total on the property, depending on whether you counted the old storage one near the lower ridge. Most days it was routine. Key in, check heat, check plumbing, walk the perimeter, note anything unusual, move on. That morning it started that way. I scraped frost off the truck windshield with a hotel key card because I couldn't find my proper scraper. Drank coffee out of a dented thermos that never kept it hot as long as it claimed, and made my first 2 stops without incident. At the Parker place, one pipe under the sink was sweating more than I liked, so I wrapped it and wrote it down. At the little red cabin near the bend, I replaced batteries in a smoke detector and noted the date on the back with a marker. Normal work. The Miller cabin was stop number 3. Same as always until the door. I told myself I'd made a logging error. That's the first place my mind went because it's the least complicated answer. Maybe I'd written secured when I'd only pulled it shut. Maybe I'd gotten interrupted by a phone call from the owner, or been thinking ahead to the next stop and my hand wrote what my body hadn't done. I don't love making mistakes, but mistakes are still better than mysteries. Inside, the place looked clean. No broken glass, no obvious damage, no smell of animals. The propane heater was running, kitchen counters clear. Blanket folded on the sofa exactly the way I'd left it, except for that chair in the center of the room. It was one of those old ladder-back chairs, heavy enough that you don't move it unless you mean to. Whoever had set it there placed it square to the door, not crooked, not casual. Just sitting in the middle of the room facing where a person would stand when they came in. I remember touching the top rail of it with 2 fingers as if that would tell me something. Wood cold, no wobble, nothing else. I made my checks because that was the job and because doing the job kept my thoughts in order. Thermostat steady, no leaks in the kitchen. Bathroom window latched, back room unchanged. In the notebook I wrote, front door found unsecured, possible prior logging error. Chair moved to center of main room, cause unknown. Reset chair to table, secured door on departure. I underlined secured harder than I meant to. The next cabin was farther up the ridge and harder to reach, enough snow packed into the shaded sections that I had to use low gear on one climb. That one had muddy boot prints just inside the back entry. Mine have a distinct tread. Deep cross pattern from an old pair of work boots I've worn for years. I know them when I see them. These weren't mine. Different sole, broader heel, slightly longer. Not a massive difference, but enough. The mud had dried at the edges and cracked, which meant they weren't from that morning. They led in 3 steps from the back door, then faded on the old braided rug. No damage there either. Nothing stolen that I could tell. But I was no longer thinking logging mistake. I was thinking maybe another contractor had been sent up for something I hadn't been told about. Maybe pest control. Maybe a plumber on short notice. Owners forget to mention things all the time and then act surprised when records don't line up. That explanation held through one more stop. Then I got to the storage cabin. It wasn't much of a cabin, really. more like a big weather-tight shed with shelves, spare propane fittings, extra blankets, canned goods, cleaning supplies, a couple boxes of light bulbs, old tools nobody had thrown away because mountain properties accumulate things the way barns do. I unlocked it and found the shelves rearranged into neat stacks so cleanly it looked almost deliberate to the point of performance. Towels grouped by size, canned goods labels turned forward, flashlights together, batteries beside them, rope coiled tighter than I would have bothered. Not robbed, organized. That got under my skin in a way the boot prints hadn't. A break-in is at least comprehensible. Theft makes sense even when it's stupid. But somebody spending time putting a storage cabin into better order than I kept it myself, out there in the middle of winter, on a private mountain property, and not taking anything. That isn't ordinary trespassing. That feels like a person settling in, or practicing. I wrote everything down. That's what I do when I don't like what I'm seeing. Writing it gives it edges. Around midday, I sat in the truck with the heater running and called the owner. I had to drive to a spot near the upper gate to get enough signal for the call to hold, which already tells you how little outside contact there was. He picked up on the third ring, sounding distracted, as owners do when the property is quiet and they assume every call is either trivial or expensive. I told him what I'd found. Unsecured door, moved chair, foreign boot prints, storage cabin rearranged. I asked if there was another worker on site. He said no. I asked if family had come through or a renter had shown up early by mistake or he'd sent anyone in for pest inspection, fuel, anything. He said no to all of it. Then he said the thing people say when they want a problem to stay small. Probably just local kids messing around. Local kids do not drive 20-something minutes up a private mountain road in winter to neatly reorganize maintenance supplies. I didn't say that because there wasn't much point. Instead, I told him I would finish my round and note anything else unusual. He said fine, and if there were signs of damage, he'd send the county deputy the next day. The next day. That was the level of urgency available up there. Still, after the call, I felt a little steadier. Not safer exactly, just more contained. The problem had been reported. Somebody else knew. And since nothing was missing and no cabin showed signs of anyone currently living in it, I let myself settle on the contractor theory again, just with more annoyance in it. Another worker, maybe hired by some family member who hadn't checked with the owner, moving through cabins, using supplies, leaving odd traces without understanding someone else was logging the property carefully. I finished the rest of the route, no new surprises. Heat okay, windows fine, one gutter sagging under old ice. A wasp nest in the eave of the southern cabin, dead for the season. By the time I got back to my own place, the day had flattened back into work. That helped more than anything. Repetition does. You put one foot after the other. Check the meter. Open the panel. Close the panel. Write it down. My cabin sat near the maintenance shed, a little lower than the others and tucked against a stand of hemlocks that blocked most of the wind. Nothing fancy. Main room, kitchenette, narrow bedroom, bathroom where the tap always squealed a second before water came through. I took my boots off by the door, heated leftover chili on the stove, and sat at the table with my notebook open under the yellow overhead light. That notebook mattered to me more than I'd admit out loud, not sentimentally, practically. It was how I proved I hadn't missed things, how I tracked weather, repairs, patterns in recurring issues. My handwriting isn't pretty, but it's consistent. Short entries, same slant, same abbreviations. If I write furnace check one day and furnace check the next, I'd notice. That's how much time I've spent with that kind of record keeping. I went through the day's notes before bed the way I always did. Miller, unsecured. Ridge cabin, unknown boot prints. Storage, supplies rearranged. I added a line to remind myself to revisit the lower road culvert if temperatures rose enough for runoff. Then I got up to lock the door, which I already knew was locked, and checked the window over the sink because the latch on that one could look shut when it wasn't. Again, routine. The false resolution, if that's what you want to call it, happened in that hour before sleep. I had done all the useful things I could do. Reported the issue, completed my rounds, secured my own cabin. Put the shotgun the owner kept in the bedroom closet closer to the door, not because I expected to use it, but because winter properties teach you to keep tools where you can reach them. Then I sat back down, looked at my own notes, and told myself this would make sense in daylight. Somebody unofficial had been using the cabins. I'd find out who. It would be irritating, maybe expensive, not sinister. I almost believed it. I brushed my teeth, came back to the table, and opened the notebook again because I remembered one supply count I hadn't entered for the storage cabin. The overhead light hummed faintly. The heater kicked on with that metallic tick baseboard units make. Outside, the woods were silent enough that I could hear a little grit of sleet beginning against the window. When I looked down at the page, there was a new entry beneath mine. I did not see anyone write it. I need to say that plainly. I was alone in that cabin. The notebook had been open on the table. I had turned away from it for maybe a minute, maybe less, to rinse my toothbrush and set the mug in the sink. And when I looked back, there was more writing. At first I thought I had somehow written it myself and blanked on it. That was my honest first thought, which tells you how hard the brain works to preserve normal. But I read the lines and knew immediately I hadn't. The handwriting wasn't identical to mine, but it was close in the way imitation gets close by studying rhythm instead of shape. Same compact letters. Same habit of not fully closing some loops. Same way I shorten cabin to cab in fast notes. It looked like my writing seen through tired eyes. The entry listed my movements from earlier that day. Left residence at dawn. Up a road slow due to shade ice. Parker, pipe wrap under sink. Red cabin, detector batteries. Miller paused on porch before entry. It went on like that, stop by stop in the order I'd made them, with details no one would have had unless they'd watched me or followed me. My mouth went dry in a very physical way, not fear as an idea, just no saliva at all. I remember swallowing and it hurting slightly because my throat had tightened. I kept reading. Storage cabin, inventory observed. Call made from gate turnout. Return route normal. Then the final line. Lights out at 11:20. I was reading it at a little after 10. I checked the clock on the microwave because I didn't trust my watch suddenly. 10:12. The green digits looked too bright. I read the line again. Lights out at 11:20. There are moments where your body decides before your mind catches up. My chair scraped back hard enough to leave a mark in the floor finish, and I was standing without remembering the middle part. The room felt wrong instantly, not because anything moved, but because every object in it had become part of the problem. The window over the sink, the dark by the bedroom door, the coat on its hook that could look like a person if I caught it sideways. I picked up the notebook and looked at the ink. Not smeared, not glossy, dry. That detail bothered me then and bothers me now. If somebody had just written it somehow, how was the ink dry? If I had written it earlier and forgotten, how did it include a time that hadn't happened yet? I listened. Nothing outside, no footsteps on gravel, no crunch under the sleet, no vehicle on the road. Just the heater ticking and that faint weather sound on the window. I went to the door and checked the lock again. Fine. Checked the back window. Fine. Checked under the bed, which I haven't done since I was probably 10 years old and felt ridiculous doing even then. Then I made the mistake of looking back at the notebook. Because once I did, I couldn't keep pretending this was only about one person being where they shouldn't be. Whoever wrote that had either been close enough to watch my whole day in detail, or had access to some pattern of mine I hadn't realized I was leaving behind. And the line about lights out wasn't a note. It was expectation. I did not turn the lights out at 11:20. I turned on every light in the cabin and kept them on until morning gray started leaking through the trees. I sat in the chair nearest the door with the notebook on the table in front of me and the shotgun across my knees, and listened to every ordinary house sound until each one felt personal. Once, sometime after midnight, I heard something brush the outer wall near the bedroom. Not a knock, not even a scrape, really. Just pressure, then release, like a hand or shoulder leaning there for a second. I didn't go look. When the sky lightened enough that outside was visible as landscape instead of reflection, I packed in under 10 minutes. Notebook first, then clothes, tools, the thermos, charger, boots, half-laced. I left some groceries in the fridge and a load of laundry damp in the washer because the thought of waiting for a spin cycle made me angry. I wrote the owner a short note on a pad by the sink saying I was leaving the property pending his direct review, locked the cabin behind me, and loaded the truck with that same feeling you get on a roof in high wind where you know speed matters more than neatness. I took the notebook with me. I drove straight down the mountain, got signal near town, and called the owner from a gas station with a mounted deer head over the coffee machine and one of those spinning racks of off-brand phone chargers nobody needs until they do. I told him I was done until he came, inspected himself. He started asking questions. I told him I'd answer later. He didn't like that. I didn't care. A deputy did eventually speak to me. Nice enough in the way people are when they don't think you're lying exactly. They just think your explanation has a hole in it somewhere that you haven't found yet. He asked if anyone could have gotten into my cabin, asked whether I'd been drinking, asked if anyone had reason to imitate me. I handed him the notebook. He spent maybe half a minute looking at the page before his expression changed from polite skepticism to something tighter, though he never said much about it. They checked the property, found signs that several cabins had been entered over time, nothing obvious linking it to one person, nothing stolen that anyone could prove, no clear campsite, no good trail camera captures either, which doesn't surprise me because those woods eat signal and batteries both. I never went back. The notebook stayed with me. It still does. Not because I enjoy having it, because throwing it away would feel like helping something stay unexamined. Every now and then I open it and read that page again. And what gets me isn't just that somebody tracked me closely enough to mimic my own way of recording the day. It's how calm the entries are. No threat in the wording, no message. Just observations, as if I was one more cabin being checked, one more routine to log and file and come back to later. And I still don't know if the unlocked doors and moved chairs and reorganized supplies were random signs of one person hiding from place to place, or if those cabins were being used in some kind of pattern, each one prepared for someone specific at different times. Story 3. The last one is the one that stayed with me the fastest because it went bad before the person telling it had time to settle into the place at all. I kept music playing because the cabin sounded too alive without it. That's the easiest way I can explain myself, and I know it makes me sound younger than I already was, but whatever. I was in my early 20s. I booked that trip by myself because I thought it would be good for me to prove I could handle being alone for a weekend. And about 10 minutes after I got there, I realized proving things to yourself in the middle of nowhere is a pretty stupid hobby. The road in was narrow and not really plowed so much as shoved aside enough for a small car to scrape through if you went slow and didn't meet anybody coming the other way. Snow piled high on both sides, trees packed in close, branches hanging heavy and white over the hood. The rental photos had made the place look cozy. In person it was still nice, just smaller, darker, and more cut off than my brain had pictured while I was booking it from my bed with a heater on, and my roommate making pasta in the next room. By the time I got there, it was late afternoon, and the light already had that blue tint it gets in the mountains when the sun is dropping behind the trees. I brought one bag of clothes, too many snacks, and this little portable speaker I take everywhere because I hate silence when I'm by myself. Not all silence. Just the kind where a house settles and you don't know what made the sound. Music helps. Even dumb background stuff helps. It makes a place feel occupied. So I got inside, set the speaker on the kitchen counter, paired my phone, and immediately made the cabin sound less empty. That first hour was normal in a forced vacation rental way. I walked around opening cabinets, checked the bathroom, looked at the guest book on the table without reading it. Noticed the decor was all fake lodge style, little wooden bears and framed black and white ski photos and one blanket that looked nice until I touched it and realized it was the roughest fabric on earth. I unpacked food into the fridge, found extra firewood by the door, and kept my music moving from room to room with me like I was trying to convince the cabin I belonged there. I didn't, really. Not yet. I need to explain that part because it matters. Some people get to a place alone and relax into it right away. I don't. I stay aware of being alone almost the whole time. Every decision becomes something I check twice in my head. Did I lock the door? Did I leave my keys where I can reach them? Did I hear something, or was that the ice maker or whatever? I hate giving in to that because it feels childish, so I usually try to act normal longer than I should. That was me the whole first evening. Acting normal, making tea, choosing a playlist, telling myself quiet could be restful if I let it. The kitchen drawer started opening on me before it was fully dark. Not all the way, just a few inches. I noticed it because I kept bumping it with my hip while walking past. It was the middle drawer on the left side of the sink. Silverware, I thought. I pushed it shut once without really looking. Came back a minute later to get a spoon and it was open again, just slightly, like somebody had nudged it from the inside. I checked the floor. The cabin was old enough that nothing looked level. My first thought was simple. Uneven flooring. Drawer slides bad. I opened it, closed it harder, even leaned down and looked at the gap around it like that would tell me anything. It stayed shut while I watched it. Fine. I made tea, took my mug to the couch, scrolled on my phone even though I barely had enough service to load anything. Music still going low, but constant. Every now and then I'd look over and see the drawer open a little again. By the fourth time I stopped being casual about it. I walked over, pulled it all the way out, and looked inside properly. Forks, knives, spoons, a can opener, one random whisk, nothing weird. I put it back in. Gave it a little extra shove with both hands, then actually laughed at myself because I was getting irritated at furniture. Later, when I went back for a spoon again, the drawer was open, and the utensils were arranged differently than before, not dramatically. That would have been easier, honestly. They were just neater. Forks nested together by size, knives lined straighter. The can opener turned so the handle faced forward instead of sideways. It looked like somebody had tidied it after me. I stood there with my mug in one hand and stared down into the drawer, trying to decide whether I was just misremembering the first layout because I hadn't paid attention. That is exactly the kind of thing I would talk myself out of. I know that about myself. So I did. I said out loud, "Okay, no, you didn't look carefully before, that's all. Vacation rentals get cleaned. The drawer was always organized. You were the one who messed it up." The problem was I didn't think I had. I closed it again and told myself to stop hovering over a silverware drawer like it was going to confess something. It got worse once the light outside went fully gone. Snow makes darkness brighter in some ways, but only outside. Inside, with the windows turning into black mirrors, every room felt shallower and stranger. I turned on more lamps than I needed. Put the speaker closer to the center of the cabin so the music filled the space better. Ate half a bag of chips for dinner because I didn't feel like cooking in a place that didn't feel settled yet. At some point, I took the trash bag from the little kitchen can and went to tie it off because I figured I'd drop it in the outside bin before bed. The bag wasn't full. That was the first thing. The second thing was that when I opened the cabinet under the sink to get another one, I noticed the roll of trash bags had been moved from where I'd put it when I unpacked. I had shoved it to the right behind a bottle of dish soap. Now it was sitting in front, centered. Again, small, so small. That's what made me stay with rational explanations even longer. I kept losing the argument with myself by margins. Maybe I moved it without thinking. Maybe I had the trash bag in my hands already and forgot. Maybe the cleaner had done the drawer weird and the bags had always been there. I grabbed my coat and took the trash outside. The cold hit my face so hard it made my eyes water instantly. The speaker was still playing inside, muffled now through the door, and I remember liking that because it meant I wasn't stepping into complete quiet. The snow around the cabin was smooth except for the line of my own prints from the car to the porch and the little wandering path I'd made earlier when I brought in my stuff. No other tracks, no animal marks either. Just mine. The air smelled like snow and pine sap and something metallic from the car engine cooling down. The outside bin was empty. I mean completely empty. I stood there holding a half-full kitchen trash bag and just looked at it. I had put a grocery wrapper and 2 tea packets in that bin earlier. Nothing major. But I had used it. I knew I had. And the small can inside the kitchen had a clean liner in it now, folded over neatly. I didn't remember changing it. That was the point where my stomach started doing that slow dropping feeling, not a jump scare thing, just this steady internal no. Because the snow outside showed only my tracks to the cabin. If someone had come and gone through the main door, there would have been other prints. I actually turned and checked again with my phone flashlight, sweeping the beam across the ground as if a second set might appear from a different angle. Nothing. Just the little shine on the crust where I'd already stepped. I went back inside too quickly and locked the door harder than necessary. The music suddenly sounded stupid, too cheerful. Some indie song with soft drums and a woman singing like everything was fine. I skipped it, then skipped again. I started checking rooms. Not because I thought I'd find a person right away, more because I wanted to prove to myself that I was being dramatic and the cabin had some other entrance or the host had come by before the snow really picked up or something equally boring. I checked the bathroom. Shower curtain open, nothing. Bedroom closet. Spare blankets and a vacuum, nothing. Back door still bolted from inside, windows all shut. I even got down and looked under the bed, which I hated doing because it made me feel 12 years old. Nothing there either. The cabin had this floor hatch near the back wall of the main room. The listing had mentioned a crawl space under the place because of plumbing access, but I hadn't paid attention. It was just a square outline in the floorboards with a little recessed metal pull ring. I noticed it mostly because I started noticing everything. I didn't open it then. I wish I had, actually. Or maybe I don't. I go back and forth. Instead, I turned the music up a little more and tried to reset. That sounds pathetic, but that's really what I did. I made myself hot chocolate from a packet I'd brought, sat on the couch with a blanket around my legs, told myself if the drawer opened again I'd laugh, close it, and go to bed early. Maybe I was overtired from the drive. Maybe being somewhere too quiet had me keying meaning onto every tiny change. The drawer stayed shut for almost 20 minutes. That made it worse. Because I started to think I had won some argument nobody else was even having, and then the speaker stopped in the middle of a song. No fade, no battery warning. Just silence. Instant silence. I looked at the speaker first, assuming it died. But the little light was still on. Then I heard movement from under the floor. Slow movement, not scratching, not the quick scatter of an animal. More like deliberate weight shifting in a confined space. A slide, Then a pause, another slide, something brushing wood from underneath with enough pressure that I could feel, more than hear, a tiny vibration through the soles of my socks. I froze so hard my shoulders hurt. And because I am apparently the kind of person who has to confirm the worst thing instead of just running at the first reasonable chance, I stood up and took 2 steps toward the hatch. I think part of me still believed it could be pipes knocking or some weird heater sound routed through the floor. That is how strong denial is when you're alone and do not want to be the person freaking out over a rental cabin. The sound stopped. That should have been it for me. That should have sent me straight out the door. Instead, I stood over the hatch, breathing through my mouth because I didn't like how loud my nose sounded in the quiet, and listened so hard I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The speaker remained dead silent. No song coming back, no connection chime, nothing. I crouched and touched the metal pull ring. It was warmer than the floor around it. I don't know if that means anything. Maybe my fingers were just cold. Maybe the metal held the room temperature better. But I remember it because it made my hand jerk back for a second. Then I hooked 2 fingers in the ring and lifted the hatch maybe an inch. Not all the way, just enough to break the seal. There are moments your brain tries to interpret in pieces because taking in the whole thing at once would be too much. First I saw dark. Then I saw shape inside the dark. Then I realized the shape was already looking up. Eyes. A pair of eyes, human level, fixed directly on the opening, so close beneath the hatch, it had been positioned right under where I was standing. I dropped it with a sound that cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. The movement below stopped at the exact same second. Not because whatever was down there left, but because it had already been still. Waiting. I think that's the part I still hate most. Not that something was in the crawl space, that it was already in place under me before I lifted the hatch. I screamed. Not a cool movie scream, just this raw sound out of nowhere while I stumbled backward and hit the kitchen counter hard enough to knock my mug over. Hot chocolate went everywhere, brown across the counter and down the cabinet front. I grabbed the speaker without meaning to, like noise was suddenly a weapon, and started shouting the first useless things that came to mind. Get out. I know you're in there. I'm calling the police. Just loud, constant, stupid human noise. Then I slammed a chair over onto the hatch and dragged the little kitchen table halfway across the floor on top of it. I don't know if that would have held anyone for even 2 seconds, but doing something felt better than standing there picturing those eyes under the boards. There was no answer from below. No pounding. No voice. That silence moved me faster than any sound could have. My keys were by the door in the pocket of my coat, thank God. I snatched the coat, shoved my feet into boots without tying them, and ran outside into the snow with no hat, no gloves, phone in one hand, speaker still clutched stupidly in the other. The cold hit like getting slapped awake. I slipped on the porch step, caught myself on the rail, and made it to the car so fast I barely remember the distance. I locked the doors the second I got in and hit the horn by accident with my forearm. It blasted once through the trees and I nearly cried from the sound of it. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys into the footwell, found them, started the engine, then realized I couldn't get the car down the road safely in full dark with the snow the way it was and the way I was shaking. So I stayed. That sounds insane now too, but I stayed in the car until morning because it felt safer than going back inside and safer than sliding off some unplowed mountain road into a ditch with no service. I turned the heat on and burst to save gas. Every few minutes I looked at the cabin windows. Once I thought I saw movement behind the curtain in the main room, but the car windshield was fogging at the edges and I can't swear to that. I called emergency services anyway and got nothing but a failed attempt because there wasn't enough signal to hold. I drove the phone around inside the car like that would help, cursing at one bar that kept appearing and vanishing. The longest part was the waiting. Not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing did. No one came out of the cabin. No lights changed. The snow outside the driver's side window kept glowing pale in the headlights until I turned them off to save battery, and then the whole world shrank to whatever the dome light hit when I opened my phone again to check signal. I pulled my knees up under my coat, played music off my phone speaker once, very quietly, then turned it off because hearing any sound at all started making me imagine an answer to it. When morning finally came, it came slow and gray, revealing everything by degrees. Trees first, then the roofline, then the porch, then the path I had made running to the car. I watched the cabin for a full 20 minutes before I decided daylight was enough to move. I did not go back inside. Not for my bag, not for the charger, not for the groceries, nothing. I started the car, backed out carefully, and drove that narrow road out with both hands locked on the wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. Once I got low enough for decent signal, I called the rental host from the side of the road and told her there was someone in the crawl space. She thought I meant an animal. I said no, a person. There was a long pause after that. I gave a statement later. So did the host, I assume. I never heard much beyond a vague follow-up that authorities had checked the property. No clear conclusion. No one gave me some satisfying final answer where they found a squatter and marched him out in handcuffs while I got my stuff back boxed up and validated. I never got the speaker back, which feels stupid to care about, except that I do. It still had my playlist pulled up on it, paused in the middle of that song like the cabin had just reached up and put a finger on it. People ask why I opened the hatch. I ask myself that too. But the real question isn't why I looked, it's how long it had been under there before I did. Because if it had been in that crawl space the whole time, then it heard the music and the drawers and me walking room to room trying to get comfortable, and it was learning exactly where I stood each night. And I still don't know if it ever actually left.